Okay, so I want you guys to be excited about energy. And I know it can feel overwhelming and a little bit confusing at times, but I want you to keep in mind that energy flows and nutrients cycle. And in order for us to see that energy flow, to get energy into our bodies, we have to understand how the chemical bonds are changed and moved. And it's such a cool, beautiful process because both cellular respiration and photosynthesis were figured out by people way smarter than me by knocking out particular enzymes and seeing what got interrupted in the process. And we don't even fully understand everything about these processes yet with the technology that we have today. And this technology, this information that we learned was done before the technology we have today. So let's get in to this energy for life. Let's talk about photosynthesis. Okay, so photosynthesis is going to be one of the key parts of the entire semester. When we talk about, even evolution or fitness and making babies, we're going to rely on photosynthesis. So here again are our chapter objectives. Please make sure that you can answer all of these by the end of this lecture. Also, don't forget that they are from your book and you should be reading the chapter on photosynthesis, which is chapter 6. So why photosynthesis matters? Photosynthesis matters because it transforms that solar energy into the chemical energy of carbohydrates. Even though you go outside and you might feel rejuvenated by some sunshine, your lizard brain needs sunshine, okay? You need to go outside, take a walk, be outside. We as animals are incapable of capturing that solar energy and converting it into a chemical energy that our cells can then use. Plants, algae, and cyanobacteria are capable of doing this. In fact, cyanobacteria is cited as one of the most important little protists that exists because it was one of the first ones that did produce photosynthesis and started producing oxygen and changed the entire course of evolutionary history on this planet. So these guys are awesome. We love them. When we talk about organisms that photosynthesize, they are considered producers. They feed themselves. And then intentionally or unintentionally, they feed all consumers. What does this mean? Yes, some plants produce food sources for consumers. For instance, the berries that grow on hollyberry trees, like those holly trees, or even like mulberry trees, or any of the sorts of berries that attract birds are intentionally produced for those consumers for seed dispersal purposes. But when a plant is producing energy that is stored in its root system, like the potatoes when we talked about starch, that's not intentionally being produced for us. That is, well, now it is because we're growing it through agricultural purposes. But really, that plant is producing those potato tubers as a way of having an energy storage for itself long term, which is why when we see the potatoes start growing, they get soft and squishy because that starch is utilized. So producers are so key. They are the foundation of food webs. They're the foundation of ecosystems. And as such, understanding photosynthesis allows you to better appreciate the greenness in the world around us. So let's talk about the photosynthetic process, okay? This begins with the end products of cellular respiration, carbon dioxide and water. And photosynthesis then produces carbohydrates in the form of glucose and oxygen, which are then used in cellular respiration. These two processes are constantly cycling between one another. When we talk about photosynthesis, the big thing here is that we are splitting water molecules in order to create a carbohydrate. We have to break the polar covalent bonds that form between two hydrogens and an oxygen in a water molecule. Solar energy can do this, and solar energy is therefore required in this process. Plants do not produce oxygen for us. Plants produce oxygen simply because oxygen in a single form, one oxygen molecule, is really, really toxic. And so by having oxygen sharing with another oxygen, those electrons, it's now neutralized, and then it's just a byproduct. It's a byproduct of splitting that water molecule. So the plants are not trying to feed us, and they are not trying to give us oxygen. It is simply the byproduct of what they do. I just love that. So here are the two steps of photosynthesis. We have the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions, also known as the Calvin cycle. I don't mind if you use Calvin cycle or light-independent reactions. I like the light-independent reactions because the name tells me something. Calvin cycle is just named after the dude that explored it and figured it out. Light-independent reactions, while I want to give Calvin his due, tells me what's happening in that process. Okay? Both of these steps take place in the chloroplast of a plant cell. So the chloroplasts themselves are the location of photosynthesis. And we remember that the endosymbiotic theory stated that chloroplasts were absorbed by early eukaryotic cells and then retained because of their property and their ability to complete photosynthesis. So this is going to be where we see the solar energy captured and converted into cellular energy as ATP. And then in the Calvin cycle, we see that ATP and NADPH plus carbon dioxide are used to generate glucose, which is a more stable form of energy. It's going to be chemical energy rather than ATP, that cellular energy. We're going to get into it more too, but let's go through the parts of the plant really quick. So when we look at a plant, the green part photosynthesize. And I know that that sounds silly, but it is important because when we talk about the parts of the plant that are capable of photosynthesis, that's going to be the part of the plant that is also responsible for allowing the carbon dioxide into the plant and removing oxygen from those cells. So the roots are going to absorb water and other nutrients that plants need, but carbon dioxide and oxygen diffuse across the plant's membrane in the leaf portion of the plant. And so it's going to move from the chloroplasts out of the plants. There's little sections called stoma. I'm pretty sure I have a picture of those. And then those sugars are going to be made in the leaves and potentially stored down in the roots long term, especially in areas where winter is a thing that plants can't synthesize year round. And so that storage of sugars in the roots allows the plant to grow effectively again the next year. When we look at the chloroplast more closely, we are going to see that the chloroplast has that double membrane, and remember it has its own circular DNA and ribosomes, and then it has another third membrane inside of the chloroplast that form these stacks called thylakoids. The thylakoid membrane is the location of the light-dependent reactions, and so that's going to be where we see a concentration gradient form. Chlorophyll and other pigments are in that thylakoid membrane, and they're going to trap that solar energy in order to generate ATP and NADPH. The stroma is then the location of the light-independent reactions or Calvin cycle, and that's going to be where we see the carbon dioxide accumulating as well as then the carbohydrates being formed. So how do plants harvest solar energy? Well, when we look at energy, we know that something that has larger waves generally has less energy, and something with shorter waves has more energy. I really do like to think about it as if you've ever been to the beach on a day when the waves are just kind of those rolling, gentle waves. There's not a ton of energy. You can go out and swim and not feel like you're getting beaten up. But if you go out on a day when the waves are really choppy, it takes a lot of energy to swim, and it can be pretty dangerous too. That's the same sort of thing that we see in this energy spectrum. Sorry, I have a little thing in my throat here, okay? So what we see in the terms of increasing wavelength and therefore decreasing energy is that we'll have these big, huge waves called radio waves. Well, you're surrounded by radio waves all of the time. They don't really hurt you, and therefore they're not very effective when it comes to trapping that solar energy and utilizing it as an energy source. They're not a good way to have an energy source. On the other end, we see the gamma rays, which have a ton of really short waves, and so they're going to have a ton of energy. But gamma waves are really dangerous. And so if a plant is exposed to a gamma ray, we might get a little Hulk plant. If you're a nerd, okay, I'm sorry. I'm not sorry. But When we look at that, then, what we see is that in the middle, there tends to be a trade off where it's the increasing wavelength and increasing energy is kind of at a place that seems a little more reasonable to manage. And as such, we find that plants utilize visible light as the main energy source. Visible light has enough energy that means that that water can be broken, but it doesn't have so much energy that it damages the leaves themselves. When we look at either side, UV radiation, you've probably heard about UV radiation. That's what you need sunscreen for, so that you don't have damage to your DNA, which can result in sunburn and eventually potentially cancer of the skin. Plants are also susceptible to damage by UV radiation. Living on land and being exposed to intense sunlight rather than living in the water like their algal ancestors did does result in the plants needing to be able to avoid damage from UV light. On the other side is infrared, and infrared does not have enough energy to split the water. We actually use infrared in things like remote controls. When you turn your TV on, the remote control is using an infrared wave. Visible light is the spectrum that makes the most sense. But when plants are capturing that visible light, they generally prefer to capture light that is closer to the UV end in terms of that purple and blue light color. We see that plants have lots and lots of pigments that can capture light. But we are going to find that plants relatively have a lot of chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and carotenoids. And these three pigments work together in overlapping ways to capture as much of the high energy wavelengths as possible, as well as some of the lower energy wavelengths. When we then look at these pigments explain why plants appear to be green. When we see plants as green, it's because the plant has more chlorophylls A and B. Chlorophylls A and B absorb that violet, blue, and red light spectrum and reflect green. When there are tons of chlorophylls present, we will not see any of what is considered the accessory pigments, such as carotenoids. Carotenoids are accessory pigments. They will absorb still that violet and blue. You see that they have these peaks here in this blue and violet, but they also absorb green lights, and they tend to reflect yellow and red. So in the fall, when leaves are changing colors and we see them being orange or yellow, it's because those chlorophylls are no longer produced, and since chlorophylls are high energy molecules, they're generally reabsorbed by plants, and we see these carotenoids present, and we leave them longer because we can still do some photosynthesis while the sun is not as strong, and it's okay to lose some of those accessory pigments rather than those large chlorophylls. In any case, plants are going to be in a range of this. There are some plants that appear purple, which means that they absorb probably more of the green light, and they appear purple or red because they don't absorb those. It depends on what plant we're looking at in particular. But for our purposes in Bio 110, we are going to talk about chlorophylls A and B and carotenoids, and I do want you to know the difference between these and what they reflect and what they absorb. With that being said, here's your first check your understanding before we get into the nitty-gritty details of those steps of photosynthesis. Make sure you can answer these questions. When you're ready, come back and we'll continue with light-dependent reactions. All right, let's talk about light-dependent reactions. I understand that this can look really scary, but this is actually really, really cool. So, what happens? Well, in the chloroplast, we have those pigments embedded in the thylakoid membrane. In the thylakoid membrane, solar energy is going to hit those photosystems of pigments. Photosystems, I'm not going to make you memorize those, but I want you to know that these are little areas where those pigments are existing. And as the light hits those areas of pigments, the electrons that exist in those pigments are excited. When those electrons are excited, they are going to actually move to the next photosystem. So they move down a series of enzymes, a series of proteins embedded in the membrane. And as such, that allows the plant to split water molecules into an oxygen and 2 hydrogen ions. The electron from the water is either used as this energy source, or it's used to replace an electron that was split from a previous molecule, okay? So in any case, the electron is gone from the hydrogens. It is being used as an energy source. So these hydrogen ions are going to be hanging out in the interior aspect of the thylakoid. Now, the plant wants to pump these hydrogen ions against a concentration gradient. So they are continually using these electrons to move the hydrogens from area of low concentration to areas of high concentration. Now, we know from learning about concentration gradients that nature does not like them. But we also know that the plasma membranes are not permeable to ions. Ions being charged are not able to just diffuse freely across that plasma membrane. So we have these electrons that are acting as a battery, acting as an energy source, that are making hydrogen ions get pumped into an area that creates a high concentration. We're splitting water molecules, we're generating oxygen, and now we have a bunch of hydrogens that are looking for a way to release the pressure of being in a high concentration gradient. The only way for these hydrogen ions to move effectively is to move across something called ATP synthase. Okay? ATP synthase, you should be able to hopefully break that word down. If it ends in ASE, it's an enzyme. ATP synthase makes ATP. So what happens? Well, ATP synthase is the only area that's like a gate in the plasma membrane for these hydrogen ions. These hydrogen ions are in these high concentrations. They want to move from areas of high concentration to low concentration. And so they zoom through ATP synthase. It lets them move through effectively. As ATP synthase is moving through these hydrogen ions, ADP and P, phosphate, are in that area. The movement of the hydrogen ions is being used to snap that phosphate onto the ADP and generate ATP. Okay, ATP synthase is built for this. It's an enzyme that is specifically built to make ATP. Hydrogen ions, though, we don't want hydrogen ions just floating around. If you remember from chapter 2 when we talked about pH, lots and lots of loose hydrogens results in things being acidic. We don't want loose hydrogens hanging around in an organelle. And so those hydrogens get picked up by an enzyme, a coenzyme called NADP+. NADP plus snags the electron that's now loose because it's been used. It's got its energy, but we don't want loose electrons and we don't want loose hydrogen ions. And so it takes those and puts them together into a molecule that can act as a carrier and take those hydrogens to the next step of the process along with the ATP to be built into a carbohydrate. I don't know. I think it's just super cool. We get an electron all excited. We split a water molecule. We use those hydrogen ions to create a concentration gradient, which Mother Nature hates. And then we have an enzyme that is specifically built to allow hydrogen ions to move, to capture that movement in such a way that it can make ATP. And then the hydrogens aren't wasted. They are added onto the NADP so that they can be used to make a carbohydrate, because carbohydrates need carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Isn't that just like the coolest thing? And the fact that we understood this before the technology we have today just blows my mind. We do know then that oxygen will bind with another oxygen through a nonpolar covalent bond and will then be released as oxygen for you to then breathe and use in cellular respiration, or for the plant to use in cellular respiration, because plants also do cellular respiration. Once we have this energy here, this is just another way of looking at this. We are seeing this electron transport chain. Again, we are pumping those hydrogen ions through ATP synthase in order to generate molecules that can be used by the Calvin cycle. I personally like this image better, but a better picture or another picture is just to see how this is working within that thylakoid space. These two slides are really the same, but sometimes we need to look at the pictures in slightly different ways to understand it. Okay? Then we're going to look at the Calvin cycle, or those light-independent reactions. Now, the Calvin cycle does occur in the stroma, which if we go back a slide, the stroma is that fluid, it's like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. So the stroma is going to be a big open space where we can see something cycle and we can actually build up a lot of carbon dioxide. So light-dependent reactions can only occur when it's sunny because they need sunlight to split the water. But building a carbon-based macromolecule like a carbohydrate takes time. It takes time to get enough carbon dioxide into the stroma of the chloroplast. So we are constantly building up carbon in the inside part of that chloroplast. And it takes time to go through the process of linking carbons together to make a carbohydrate. So the Calvin cycle is actually occurring 24/7. This particular process does not stop. It's not the most efficient because the enzymes responsible are not the most efficient enzymes. In fact, the enzyme Rubisco, which is responsible for carbon fixation, can also bind to oxygen, which oxygen cannot then be used to build a carbohydrate because we have oxygen and CO2. We need the carbon as the carbon backbone. But basically, there are a series of steps here. I'm not going to make you memorize all of the nitty-gritties and the enzymes and things responsible. But I do want you to understand that for every turn that this process goes through, every time carbon fixation occurs and we go through reduction and regeneration and we build a carbohydrate, we're only making one G3P, which is glyceraldehyde triphosphate. So we are not making a glucose molecule yet. We are making the precursor to a glucose molecule. We are making a 3-carbon sugar. And the reason being is that the 3-carbon sugar can move out of the chloroplast more effectively. A glucose molecule itself is very large and cannot move across the membrane of the chloroplast and would take a lot of energy to move through bulk transport. But G3P can effectively be moved across the membrane. And then once that G3P makes its way into the cytoplasm of the plant cell, it can be used to make whatever the plant may need from it. Again, the light-independent reactions are occurring 24/7. They take the ATP and the NADPH from that light-dependent reaction, as well as the carbon dioxide that's being built up in the stroma, and they use that to make the beginnings of a glucose molecule, a G3P. 2 cycles makes 2 G3Ps, which would make 1 glucose molecule. Okay? Plants may not use G3P directly to make glucose. They might if they need it, okay? They might just send that G3P right to the mitochondria because why make glucose to then break glucose? Instead, you would just send that product right to the mitochondria and maybe use that for growth or producing energy as needed. They can also use that to make cellulose, so they might make glucose that goes to cellulose or glucose that goes to starch. We also can see it being used to make sucrose in the form of like your fruit sugars, or it can even go out and be used to make amino acids, glycerols, and fatty acids. G3P is going to be a good precursor because the plants might need it to make any sort of number of molecules, and it absolutely can do that effectively. That is photosynthesis. Make sure that you can build a table for photosynthesis and make sure you can fill in the flowchart. There is a video associated to that for the flowchart. Please watch that as well. And let me know if you have any questions. Have a great day.